The Vicani Coherence sent its opening packet at 03:12 hours, ship time, and addressed it to the Navigation Corps. Not to the captain, not to the crew manifest, not to any of the 17 human beings currently eating, sleeping, or standing watch aboard the UES Meridian Fold. It addressed its communication to the navigational architecture, the ship's routing intelligence, the layered decision tree that kept us from flying into stars. As first contact protocols went, it was the most efficient misunderstanding I had ever witnessed from a front row seat. I was ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, attached to the Fold as a technical observer, which is the polite way of saying I was there to listen, catalog, and report anything worth reporting back to people who made decisions I was never cleared to know about. The Fold was an experimental hull, asymmetric, ungainly by warship standards, bristling with sensor arrays and relay dishes that gave her the silhouette of something assembled by committee during an argument. She was not built for battle. She was built for hearing things other ships couldn't hear. On this particular morning, she heard the Vicani Coherence for the first time, and so did I. Commander Relia Osk pulled me out of my bunk herself. She had the decency to knock twice before opening the hatch, which told me whatever was on her face when she said, "Tavares, you need to be on the bridge right now," was not panic. It was something quieter than panic. I have spent enough years in rooms where bad news arrives to know the difference. Panic is loud. What Osk had was the careful expression of a person looking at something they do not yet have a category for. The bridge of the Fold was cramped by fleet standards. Everything on her was cramped. The sensor arrays ate the volume that a warship would spend on fire control and crew berthing. 6 stations, low lighting, the main display running the passive read on the signal that had woken us. The duty watch was already there. Ensign Corrigan at comms had routed the incoming packet to every station and was sitting very still with his hands in his lap, which is what Corrigan did when he was trying not to show that his hands were shaking. I read the packet on the secondary display. The Vicani Coherence, I would learn the name in the translation that followed, a name that parsed into something like, the body of correct thought that has achieved continuity, had been observing us for 11 days. They had cataloged our drive signature, our hull geometry, our power output, our emission profile. They had mapped the Fold's navigational intelligence in some detail. Their packet opened by addressing that intelligence directly, in machine language, with a formal proposal. The Coherence wished to establish a communication channel with the reasoning architecture aboard this vessel, to discuss territorial demarcation and the terms under which human vessels might transit the Coherence's volume of influence. The Navigational Corps, being a navigational corps, had no opinion on the matter and filed the packet as an unrecognized external interrupt. I looked at Commander Osk. She looked at me. "They think the ship is the person," she said. "They think the ship is the person," I confirmed. There was a silence on the bridge that I would describe, in my report, as thoughtful. In reality, it was the silence of 7 people sitting with the specific cognitive discomfort of being categorized as irrelevant by an alien intelligence that had spent 11 days watching them. The Vicani Coherence, we would later understand, were a distributed synthetic mind, not a species that had built machines, but a species that had become one, had shed biological substrate so far back in their history that the concept of a meat-based crew operating a vessel struck them as roughly equivalent to bacteria steering a ship. The vessel was the entity. The biological components were, in their model, either a maintenance function or a pest. They had filed us under maintenance function, which was generous. I drafted the reply myself, because that was my job. Commander Osk read it, changed 2 words, and authorized transmission. We sent it in the Coherence's own machine language, which we had been able to partially parse from their packet, a thing they did not expect us to be able to do as it turned out, but I am getting ahead of myself. The reply read, in its essentials, "The navigational intelligence of this vessel does not make decisions. The entities that make decisions aboard this vessel are biological. You have been speaking to the wrong party. We are the decision-making substrate. We would like to talk." There was a gap of 4 minutes and 17 seconds before the Coherence responded. I have sat in a lot of silences. Intelligence work is mostly silence. Silence in rooms, silence on channels, silence in the space between what someone says and what they mean. 4 minutes and 17 seconds from a hyper-rational distributed synthetic consciousness that processes at speeds we cannot fully measure is not 4 minutes and 17 seconds of nothing. It is 4 minutes and 17 seconds of something very large recalibrating. Their second packet was addressed to the crew. The conversation that followed lasted 6 hours and is classified at a level I am not going to discuss here. What I can tell you is that the Vicani Coherence had a well-developed framework for encountering new machine intelligences, protocols, established precedents, territorial courtesies refined over what translated as several thousand years of contact with other synthetic civilizations. They had encountered biological species before. In every prior case, the biological species had been operating vessels that were, by coherent standards, genuinely autonomous, machine intelligences of sufficient complexity that the biological crew was effectively a legacy system, present but not primary. The Fold's navigational core ran to about the cognitive complexity of a good chess engine. It could plot courses and flag hazards. It could not, in any meaningful sense, want anything. We, on the other hand, had opinions. We had a commander who had navigated 2 prior first contact situations and approached the third with the particular brand of patience that comes from having been surprised before and not caring for the experience. We had an ensign with shaking hands who had nonetheless stayed at his station and done his job. We had a signals officer who had spent 3 years developing partial translation matrices for machine language protocols she had never expected to actually use. We had me, which I will let stand without further elaboration. The Coherence's framework had no entry for this configuration. Their territorial protocols assumed that the negotiating party would be the ship, that they would be agreeing terms with an entity that could, in principle, continue existing independently of the biological components aboard it. The idea that the biological components were in fact the entity, and that the ship was closer to a tool than a mind, required them to go back through 11 days of observation and re-weight every data point. The power curves they had read as the navigational core asserting operational preference were us choosing headings. The communication patterns they had catalogued as machine-to-machine handshakes were us talking to each other. What we were, in their revised model, was something they did not have a precedent for. A biological species operating at a level of organizational coherence and technological capability that placed us by their own metrics in the category of entities worth negotiating with, but doing so from inside fragile, lossy organic bodies, which struck the Coherence as structurally improbable. Their closest analog, from what I could parse of the cultural data embedded in their later transmissions, was something like an ancient civilization they had once encountered that kept sending its most senior members into the field personally, unarmored, on the grounds that the presence of a decision-maker was itself a signal. We were, to the Vicani Coherence, the equivalent of a king who had shown up to the negotiating table in his own body, in a room with no guards, and expected to be taken seriously. They took us seriously. By hour 4, we had an agreement on transit corridors. By hour 6, we had the first framework for what would become the Meridian Accords, not because the Fold was a warship, not because we had firepower to display, not because we made any kind of threat. We had none of those things. What we had was the Coherence's dawning recognition that the entity they were dealing with was the crew, was 17 human beings who had woken up in the middle of the night, read an alien transmission, figured out they were being addressed wrong, and politely corrected the error. That the biological things operating this ungainly sensor platform had done so without apparent distress, without escalation, and with enough machine language fluency to meet the Coherence on their own ground. The fleet they had positioned 11 light minutes off our stern, 7 vessels, which we had not known about until they disclosed it in hour 2 as a gesture of good faith, stood down and held position. Commander Osk signed the framework documents at 09:18 hours. She used a pen, because she preferred pens. The Coherence's cultural analysis suite, which had been running the entire conversation, flagged the pen as a significant data point. A species that had achieved interstellar travel and retained an instrument for marking physical surfaces with pigment was, by their reckoning, not a species that had forgotten where it came from. I put that in my report. I was told, later, that someone senior had underlined it. The Vicani Coherence had spent 11 days watching the Fold and concluded that the ship was the mind. It took them 6 hours of talking to us to understand what we were. It took them the rest of that day to stop being surprised about it. As far as I know, they have not stopped thinking about it since.